Okay, well, getting straight to our second session, I'd like to welcome on stage now Zinaid Meeran, South African writer, Nnedi Okorafor, and facilitator Melinda Ferguson. And their discussion is entitled Exploring Genre in African Writing. Please welcome them on stage.
Gosh, we actually might have to wear sunglasses up here. It's really, really bright, but we're going to try not to. So if we do, we're not trying to show you we're part of the mafia. We just can't see anything. Good evening, everybody. I feel very honored to have been asked to facilitate this panel. I've got what I believe two of the most exciting, out-of-the-box, interesting writers. No offense to any of the others, but I'm very drawn to anarchy, trouble, unboxable ideas. And for me, I don't know if they're trouble, but they definitely pose an interesting, challenge to try and understand and try and fit their works into any set type of box. I'm going to introduce basically both of them, but one at a time. I'm going to speak to tell you who Nnedi Okorafor is first. She's our special guest from the USA. Nnedi was born in the USA, but she has Nigerian roots, and she is a multi-award-winning novelist. She has won the fantastic Wally Soyinka Prize for African Literature. She won that in 2008 for her book Zara, the Windseeker. And she also won for her adult novel, Who Fears Death, which is this book, and I've just bought it, hint, hint. She won the World Fantasy Award, which we're going to talk a bit about that later, but it was really an amazing achievement, and that was she won in 2011. Miss Okorafor holds a PhD in literature and is a professor of creative writing at Chicago State University. And then we have, on my right, the fabulous Zinaid Meeran, who is Durban-born, Cape Town-based, who's multi-talented, a photographer, a filmmaker, and a rather fantastic writer. He holds a Bachelor of Science, Social Science degree from the University of what was then known as the University of Natal, an honors degree in politics from UCT, as well as a master's degree in critical studies, as well as an MFA from the University of California, and he studied film at UCLA. So very multi-talented. And he won the European Union Literary Award for his first debut novel, Saracen at the Gates, in 2009, and that's when he first came onto the literary scene in South Africa. And his second novel, Tanuki Ichiban, is a daring and comic offering, which was recently published in 2012. So we have a great panel. Let's get in. The topic tonight is exploring genre in African literature. And, I've been trying to get my head around that, and I thought the best way to start and kick off this panel is to, Zinaid, start with you, and just kind of briefly unpack what you believe the African literature genre is all about, if there is such an interpretation of this term.
Oh, well, I think this panel might more properly be termed the antimatter of genre, considering where we're coming from. The way I see genre is that it's largely an industrial process where art products are constructed to make them marketable. And a little bit less cynically, or a critical category where I would say critics are flooded with data, with information, and they need to sift through it, and categories start to arise out of that. But more diabolically, I think, there's an element of social control, I think, over the free flow of ideas. So I think it's very much in the interests of the dominant discourse to delineate how ideas are propagated. So genres are are encouraged in all of the arts, especially literature and film. And
how would
I think that there is a useful element to genre too,
Yeah.
where the artist can organize their own ideas, like as an organizing principle.
But do you see genre as being quite a restrictive thing in terms
Yeah.
of trying to box you into something and label you as something which you find maybe is not what you really are about?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that for certain kind of writer, it's very frustrating to have that thrust on you.
Yeah. And Nnedi, how would you, if you had to label your writing, or you had to put yourself in a specific kind of genre, how would you where would you put yourself?
That's a very good question. I think I would probably put myself in my own category of Nnedi. That's it. Because I write, I guess, what's considered, and I always say what's considered, because these are all labels that I don't think I quite fit in, and that I do fit in at the same time. I have a foot in several different types of categories. I write what's considered science fiction, fantasy, magical realism, and African literature. And I guess I would define African literature as literature that focuses on African issues and culture written by Africans. And that's very vague.
Very broad, yeah.
And it's vague, but when you hold a magnifying glass up to that category, it all falls apart. Because then you start having to define who is an African, what does that mean, what is culture, and then questions of authenticity start coming in. So when I say that I write African literature and I'm American born, then all the questions of authenticity start coming up too.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? So I guess that would be my definition. And in terms of my own category, I feel happier if I just say that's just Nnedi doing whatever Nnedi does.
I mean, if you've won a fantasy award, you've been called a science fiction writer, all of those things are almost not things that fit easily, that black women, let's say, for example, would normally be associated with. Have you found a lot of that type of, oh my word, you're black, you're female, and you're writing science fiction? How did that happen?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting because writers like Octavia Butler paved the way for writers like me, because she went through most of that. You know, when she was getting her stuff published, Octavia Butler is an African-American science fiction writer who was very successful, very, very successful, and one of the most well-known science fiction writers, period. And when she was getting her stuff published, her work was so, her main characters were all black American, and this was so odd to the science fiction community that her books, several of her books the covers, even though her characters were blatantly described as African American. You know, it's very clear when you read her books that they are African American. On the cover, they had to put white characters. You know, so and that's something that a lot of well, I wouldn't say a lot because there are very few of us black science fiction and fantasy genre writers have to deal with. This happened to me too. My second novel, the same thing happened. My main character, sub-Saharan African, described as black-skinned. When my publisher came back to me with the initial cover, they put a white girl on there. So it's like that's something that that's just a small example of the issue that's within the genres of fantasy and science fiction that even the publishers are a little nervous. They're a little nervous about putting black people on the covers and marketing something that's considered science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah. And Zinaid, have you had people kind of assuming that you're writing for the Indian population in South Africa?
Well, I think Cyrus at the Gates was received a little bit that way, which was flabbergasting for me, because for me it was about a curry mafia princess who fell in love with an anarchist girl and then goes on the rampage trying to overthrow Johannesburg's sex slavery industry. And it's about what's specific to those characters rather than some sort of totalitarian category. like a racial category.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we were talking about, let's try and talk more about your second book, but in Saracen, you explore a raceless society in a very race-conscious country.
In Tanuki.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
Well, Saracen tried to do that too.
I also thought so,
tried to
actually.
locate that kind of attitude of not having a racial identity, but portrayed with at least one character, Zakira, who's living within what's seen as a community, as the Muslim community of Fordsburg.
Yeah.
But I think the way publishing and marketing works, that was seized upon. The location, the geographical location that she lives in. So with Tanuki, I think I took it much further. And I feel that I've had to invent my own genre.
You have, yeah.
And I call it riot waif. Waif as in dejected, abandoned children. And rioting as in they aren't children, abandoned, rejected people who've given up, but who fight back, who resist. And I think a classic example are the Wombles, those critters that live underground and come up and live on the litter that ordinary folks leave behind, you know. So it's about people who live outside of outside of society, who try to wrest control of their identities away from society and relocate it in themselves. And I think that this genre, if you want to call it that, looks at the human as more a buzzing swarm of sparks of associations and identifications rather than concrete categories. The plodding, dinosaur categories really, like race and ethnicity and nationalism, that were constructed, invented by colonialism, apartheid, and these are characters who want to live outside of that. So I think the best way is to illustrate my genre is to
read something.
Yeah, read something that illustrates illustrates some of these characters. Because I think for any kind of imagined world, it's the population within them that matter. So Geronimo Changgeun is a gleaner, so he lives off litter and trash, anything discarded. And he's chosen as the mud traffic control officer of Cape Town. So the book is set in a futuristic South Africa with an alternate history where colonialism ended in 1820, apartheid never happened, and the population is completely, there is no race. So anyway, Geronimo, living on the edge, so Geronimo Changgeun was never quite sure how he ended up as mud traffic control officer, Port of Cape Town. It was not the sort of profession you studied towards and applied for. After all, his mentor, Philpot Chikane, was an illiterate who knew nothing whatsoever about maritime law, traffic trigonometrics, urban planning, or any of the other professional stuff his underlings were proficient in. Even email puzzled him. It had been 3 years ago already. Geronimo had been scavenging shards of broken watermelon at the Ribbeck Street Farmers Market when Philpot, so obese he toddled about like a pregnant swan, approached him. Over the following months, Philpot stalked Geronimo at the market, always a 2-liter Coke in one paw and a rack of barbecue spare ribs in the other, explaining the joys of mud traffic control. The seduction was slow. It was immediately clear to Philpot that Geronimo had not the slightest interest in working for the city, or anywhere for that matter. Geronimo seemed content to sit in the gutter, fulfilling his daily protein quota with a handful of watermelon seeds he had gleaned from the discarded rinds. The dopey-faced young man of indeterminate age maintained a goofy grin, blue-black fringe kept off his face with an office crocodile clip, so better to allow the introduction of fruit waste and decaying salad matter to his full lips. Philpot at first thought the boy autistic or worse, plain doff, but their first conversation pleased him, replete as it was with worldliness. However, Philpott sensed Geronimo was an adept at spatial juggling, the singular talent necessary in the protege he charged himself with finding. Geronimo's passage through the snowdrifts of browning lettuce leaves, tattered spinach fronds, trampled samples of stone fruits, apple quarters and pear fifths, prawn heads and mussel shells, and the way he could assemble from this rubbish a tagliatelle vongole a la KFC skins with a side of damp kettle chips, salad of gem squash shavings and butternut purity, with a dessert of semi-chewed Chappie's bubble gum on sun-baked oat cakes, told Philpott all he needed to know. So that's Geronimo. And I think to illustrate another aspect of this kind of life is besides its fluidity, this alienation from society can result often in, well, it can result in self-mutilation, where these characters have really the most control they have over anything is over their own bodies. So eventually Geronimo ends up in Japan as a bounty hunter. So I'll just read some of that. Geronimo decided to glean his way up to Hokkaido. He had heard foreigners could work in vermin clearance, in this case the brindled snow ape. The population of this once prized tourist attraction had exploded as the snow line crept deeper into Honshu with each passing winter, dragging the ape line along with it. The overheated summers and the berry bushes that flourished with it fed the apes to rampant horniness and fecundity. Over winter, the apes would flow like lava from their geyser-fed steam baths on the snowy heights, carrying out dawn raids on garbage bins and careless kitchens in the suburbs. Following the snow line as it crept southward, many set up home in the steaming sewers of the city. Hence their name, the Stink People. Feeding on shit, they grew strong and fast, and after the first toddler was seized, more than one city councillor intimating for the purposes of sex, not food, vermin status was a shoe-in. Hugging the coast did not yield the supply of picnic leftovers Geronimo had counted on. In fact, there were few beaches on which to picnic. He took to drying the odd kelp frond he found here and there, feeding off the homemade nori, spitting out titanium and petroleum like grape pips. By the time he got to the whaling station at Ohashi Samui on the northern bight of Honshu, he was in the latter stages of scurvy. The last fruit he had eaten was a half-rotten bag of tangerines a child had thrown at him from a passing car 3 weeks ago. Not as charity, but target practice. He put this good fortune down to the hobo look he had been sporting for some time. There had been the incident outside a truck stop where all the bins yielded only polystyrene, which he licked and sucked to extract all the takeaway juices. A truck rolling by had doused him in a violet blend of mud and spilled diesel. Washing his jacket and jeans in seawater a few days later had only caused the gunge to fasten into the threads. Then there was his beard, which had grown to his crotch. Every morning, he would spend at least 5 minutes separating his dead straight beard from the Velcro pad of his pubic hair. Then there were the purple trenches that emerged under his eyes, signs of irretrievable malnutrition. These would fill with rainwater in the sudden summer thunderstorms, and waking up one morning in a nest fashioned from rock concert posters, he had found swimming in them a tiny insect with excellent posture known as a water snout. He had no recollection of the Japanese name. This he had eaten without hesitation.
I mean, Zinaid, your attention to detail is phenomenal. I mean, I kind of think, like, what world are you living in, brother? I mean, what stories did you like as a child? The usual sort of Hansel and Gretel. I mean, look, I would carry on for 2 hours with you, but I need to pay attention to the lady on your right, going from there, it's just an amazing mind shift, because I want to talk to you a bit about your book, Who Fears Death, which is, I mean, there's so many amazing things that have been said about it, but basically you're dealing with pretty brutal issues in this book, like genocide, rape, female circumcision, and then counteracting it with amazing elements of fantasy and escapism. So this very, like, almost feminine, beautiful coloring of very, very, very harsh and dark subjects. So I want to know where your mind's at and how you came upon, I suppose, what is your fascination with these themes that I've just mentioned?
Well, Who Fears Death it's my third novel, and it took me 6 years to write, and it started off over 700 pages. And it took me another 2 years to get it down to the 380 that it is now. It's not a novel where I set out to write about every single horrible issue in Africa today. That wasn't something I wanted to do at all. I write very subconsciously, or unconsciously. And I take from what's around me. And the genesis of Who Fears Death, though, really, it was the passing of my father. So, and even the opening prologue is taken directly from something that I felt that at my father's, at his wake keeping. And it's always, whenever I read it, it's very difficult for me to read, because I know that even though this book is fantasy and science fiction, all these other things, it's very much nonfiction. There's a lot of me in this book. So that was the genesis of it. And I wrote that initial that was the very first thing that I wrote, the prologue, which moved to the end of the novel, it moved to the middle, but eventually it moved right back to where it started. And when I wrote it, I had no outline, no nothing. I just was writing because I experienced this moment. It was when I was at my father's, at his wake keeping, and I found myself in that room alone with him. And this was in the United States. He was later buried in Nigeria. But I found myself alone with him in that room. And I just remember looking at his face and thinking, that's not my dad anymore, because he's clearly gone elsewhere. And then I just remember this intense amount of emotion welling up within me. And it wasn't good. It was destructive. And it felt like something that would explode and destroy everything around me. And I remember my mom and my sister coming in there and dragging me out of there. And it was that night where I sat down and wrote the prologue to Who Fears Death, which if you read it, you'll see that it describes exactly that, and then more that happens with the character. And so, yeah, when I wrote that, I didn't know where the story was going. I just kept writing, and a lot of times I just do that. And eventually all of the issues, the things that, as I said on opening night, I'm a listener. I listen to stories, and I listen to the stories around me, and in particular the stories of women, and all of these narratives of the women around me, from when I'm in Nigeria listening to the elders speaking, the older women, and usually I like to just sneak around, I like to just kind of stand in the back, because if they see I'm there, they're not going to talk. So I stand in the back and listen, and I get stories that way, or I just listen to conversations. And so I get stories from my relatives in Nigeria, and then also my relatives and family friends in the States. And I just gather those. And it wasn't like I was doing research. It was just I was listening. And so when I sat down to write Who Fears Death, all those stories just came, and they all became part of the story. The genocide was mixed with the genocide in the Sudan, because Who Fears Death is a post-apocalyptic novel that's set in Sudan, like probably about hundreds of years from now. But it's the same thing happening again, because when you don't right your wrongs, they tend to keep repeating. So there's that. But also, my family I'm Igbo. And during the Biafran War, which is the Nigerian Civil War in the 60s, a lot of what people often call genocide happened in Nigeria, in the state of Biafra, which is a long story. So I've been listening to narratives about that. Every Nigerian has those ghosts. Every night, no matter what ethnic group you're from, you have those ghosts. The ghost of Biafra is still very much alive. So you hear those narratives. So those kind of found their way into my story. Female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision, which is a very incorrect term for it, is, you know, I've known people who have been circumcised, and I've heard their stories. There's one Nigerian woman I know who, even though she was born in the United States and she had two sisters, her aunt, her mother, both of her sisters were all circumcised, and she's Igbo. And the only reason she wasn't is because she's in the United States. So there's that. So I've heard those stories. Basically, all the issues that I'm dealing with in Who Fears Death are from stories that I've heard around me, and they all wound up in this narrative. So really, that's where it came from. Even the mystical aspects of it, those are also things that, one, I'm very interested in, but they're also things that just, they're around me. They're around me, and they found themselves in Who Fears Death. So I guess that's really where it came from.
Would you like to read us something?
Sure. I'm going to read, I've read the prologue so many times. I'm going to read from another section that I've never read before. I'm going to keep it short, just about a page and a half. And just to tell you a little about our main character, 'cause this is in the middle of the story, and I really cannot, this is near the end, and I really cannot summarize the whole novel for you. The main character, the book is called Who Fears Death, and the main character's name is Onye Sonwu, which means Who Fears Death in Igbo. And I knew I couldn't name it that because it would scare people away from the novel. So, so that's our main character. Now, okay, the book, when I describe her, it's going to sound like the book is really heavy, and I don't want anyone to be like, oh, I can't read that because it's so dark. It's dark, but there's a lot of light in the story. So, our main character, I'll tell you a few things about her just to give you an idea, and then I'm just going to read this and you guys can figure out the rest. Okay, she is born of what's called weaponized rape. She's a product of that. Everyone has a good idea of what weaponized rape is? If not, figure it out, Google. Okay. When she was 3 years old, her singing would attract owls. When she's 11 years old, and I'm going to give this away because I can't talk about this novel without this is a big giveaway, but whatever. When she was 11 years old, she voluntarily has herself circumcised. Because being a product of weaponized rape in this world, you look like neither your mother nor your father, and you're an outcast. And she was trying to fit in. And that was the only way she could figure out, that was the only way she could think of to try to fit into her small village. It didn't work, of course. When she's 16, her stepfather dies, and that's what the prologue is. And let's see. And at this point, she's left her village to seek revenge for her mother against her father. Okay. And I'm just starting this in the middle of nowhere. That's just how it is. Okay. My heart pounded harder. I moved forward. They're out in the desert right now, and they're living in tents. I moved forward. When I pushed the flap aside, I crawled out. I almost bumped right into it. I looked up, up, and up. It stood directly before our tent, tall as a middle-aged tree, wide as 3 more tents. A masquerade, a spirit of the wilderness. Unlike the violent needle-clawed one that guarded Aro's hut the day I attacked him, this one stood as stone. It was made of tightly packed dead wet leaves and thousands of protruding metal spikes. It had a wooden head with a frowning face carved into it. Thick white smoke dribbled from the top. This smoke was what was producing the smell. Around it strutted about 10 guinea fowl. They looked up at it every so often, heads tilted, softly whistling questioningly. 2 sat on its right and 1 on its left. A monster that attracts cute, harmless birds, I thought. What next? The masquerade stared down at me as I slowly stood up. Mwita was right behind me. Yards away were Diti and Fanasi and a growing crowd of onlookers. Fanasi had his arm around Diti's waist as she clasped him for dear life. A terrified Luyu was hiding behind her tent directly to my right. I wanted to laugh. Luyu stayed, and Diti and Fanasi cowered. What do you think it wants? Luyu loudly whispered as if the creature weren't right there. She crept closer. Maybe if we give it what it wants, it'll go away. Depends on what it wants, I thought. Suddenly, the creature began descending to the ground, its raffia body packing upon itself. The guinea fowl sitting beside it moved a foot to the side before sitting down. The masquerade stopped descending. It was sitting, too. I sat down before it. Muita sat behind me. Luyu stayed close by, too. She didn't have a magical bone in her body, and this made her bravery in the face of the mysterious that much more amazing. With its head closer to the ground, the strange-smelling smoke around us grew thick. My lungs hitched, and I worked hard not to cough. That would have been rude, I knew. Several of the guinea fowl actually did cough. The masquerade didn't seem to care. I glanced at Luyu and nodded. She nodded back. Tell them all to step away, I told her. Without a hint of questioning, she went to the people. She says, get back, Luyu said. That's a masquerade, a woman blankly replied. I don't know what it is, Luyu said, but it's come to speak with her, a man said. We just want to watch. Luyu turned to me. At least now I knew what it wanted. The red people continued to amaze me with their instinctive knowledge of the mystical. Move back anyway, I said flatly. It's a private talk. They moved to a seemingly safe distance. I saw Fanasi and Diti push into the crowd and disappear. Then it was speaking to me. I'll stop there. Thank you. And to tell you a little about masquerades, those are a very rich Nigerian tradition amongst all of the ethnic groups. And masquerades make an appearance. They're basically manifestations of the ancestors and spirits. And they wind up in every single one of my stories. So that's just one masquerade.
I just want to ask, how are we doing for time? Are we fine? Yeah? 5 more. You, wow. Okay, that goes. It's so hard because you both, deserve my attention completely. So I have to divide it between the two of you. So I keep on, I want to ask you a whole lot of stuff about your thing, but I know I've got to drive this forward. So, Zinaid, do publishers have to be brave to publish work like yours?
I think I have to be brave to be able to live in poverty.
I mean, I find your world fascinating that you've created in both your books, but especially in your second book. And I'm just wondering, how do readers relate to your work? Do they get you? And do you sell books?
I think I'm the best, my biggest customer. I think I bought the most copies of Tanuki. Yeah.
But I mean, so definitely there's a certain type of reader, or at least an explorative, maybe adventurous type of reader who's going to get you.
I think South Africa is sort of straining right now against the old, traditional literature, traditions of South African literature,
yes,
which are very progressive, but still use the categories that were in place. And I think readers would want something new, something that explores the widening of the South African culture, becoming much more cosmopolitan and outward-looking, and also allowing a fluidity to the way people construct themselves and their image and all the rest of it.
But you definitely have a sense of a man ahead of his time, which is always a great thing. Rather be the one ahead than behind. And then Nnedi, I mean, there are many things I still want to ask you, but I found it very inspiring that you had won this award that's normally given to white men, probably, yes, a World Fantasy Award, and you, a young black female writing science fiction. I mean, how did that make you feel?
That was extremely overwhelming because what's ironic is when I found out, because I'm a professor, and I wasn't able to go to the ceremony, and I happened to be visiting a student who was in jail that day. So I had my cell phone. This student was one of my favorite students, and he did something stupid, and he landed in Cook County Prison. And I was visiting him there. And so when you visit people in jail, you have to leave your cell phone behind. So I was in there, and then I came out very upset at what I had seen in there. Just when you go into American prisons, you see black men, just black men, like all just in jail, incarcerated, wasting away. So I was pissed and angry, and I was sitting there in my car, and I turned my cell phone on, and suddenly it just started buzzing and buzzing and buzzing like crazy. I'm like, what is this? I had even forgotten that the World Fantasy Award ceremony was that day. And that was how I found out that I had won. So it was like this weird, I was mad, but I was happy. I just sat there. So it was really incredible. But what was interesting also is that the World Fantasy Award is, I think it's either 32 or 33 years old, at least when I won it in 2010. And I was the first non-white person to win the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Thank you. And on top of that, the award itself, when it arrived in the mail, that's when the fun really began, because the award itself was the bust of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, he is an author. He is a science fiction author who is known for, well, I knew that he had some issues with Jews and black people. I knew, but it took a friend of mine coming over and seeing the bust and screaming, "Why is this in your house?" for me to really realize just how bad it was, because then he showed me a poem that Lovecraft had written called The Creation of a Nigger. Yes, and this was the award that had been given. So now, after winning this award, I was faced with, do I say something? And then at first I was angry that no one else had really gotten angry, but you know, when I realized just how serious it was and that nobody was doing anything about it, I knew I had to start talking. And then, so I went out and I wrote a blog post that really just broke it down, because I'm strongest when I'm writing. So once I put it on paper, I will tear you apart. And I did. And I did. And to add, that blog post, where my blog normally gets like maybe 100 hits, this blog post got over 10,000. Okay, so it really, I was able to get the word out, and then it started a lot of dialogue about why do we have this author representing the World Fantasy Award. So yeah, that was fun.
Okay, now, I mean, the last question I'm going to ask, and it's kind of a quick one, and wrap it up quickly, but Zinaid, just to inspire some, I'm sure there are many writers out, or aspirant writers out there tonight. How do you go about your work? What is your work process? How do you approach your writing?
Well, I shuttle between film and photography and writing, so whenever one becomes frustrating, I just switch to the other, and then back, and then back and back. And I'm willing to plumb my own life, I think. And when you do that, it flows. If you're willing to expose your own life and fictionalize it, then books seem to result from that. Yeah.
Thank you. And Nnedi?
My writing process. I am a very busy woman. I have a 9-year-old. I am a full-time professor teaching 4 classes a semester, and I still manage to find time to write. And the way I've done that is discipline. I'm very, very, very disciplined. I work out every day, and that's part of my writing process. And then also I manage to, I'm both versatile but rigid. So even though I might not write at the same time in the day, I make sure that I write at some point for the same amount of time in the day. And then also something that I think parents, especially mothers, have to learn how to do is to really get it done, is to learn how to drop into concentration instantly. When you get that time, when you get that 1 hour to write, you have to, because a lot of times you'll just mess around and dilly-dally and not get anything done, surf the web and go on Facebook and waste time, and then your hour is done. You have to be able to sit down and drop into the story immediately, and then that hour becomes very, very productive. Once you learn how to do that, you can get a lot done.
Fabulous. Okay, before we wrap it up for the whole night, let's open it up. If anyone's got any questions, we can ask them now.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about some more stuff to do with genre. Sort of whether you like it or not, always anything that any piece of work that's created is always going to be related to some other kind of body of work, and you find yourself being given a genre whether you intended to work with that in the first place or not. And both of you have experienced that in terms of sort of racial or ethnic communities, and or being called science fiction or avant-garde, maybe along those lines. But on the one hand, it gives you access to a kind of interpretive community. It buys you sort of purchase in a readership that might be able to sort of read your work within a certain kind of interpretive context. And then on the other hand, it's, if you're not writing for that and writing for yourself, you potentially alienate yourself and isolate yourself because there's no sort of way of contextualizing that for a sort of larger community of people who want to associate your work with a certain other body of work. So I was just wondering how you negotiate that kind of wanting to be yourselves but potentially alienating yourselves, and being able to access a community who knows about a certain body of literature.
Well, in my case, I feel that there is actually that community. If you're writing something and you feel that you're resisting the discourse around you, there is most likely that community that's the new genre, that your work would fit into that new genre, waiting underground or unheard from or without anything to read, that they can relate to. So I think that feeling of tension is a good signal that you're not going to be isolated forever, There might not be that marketing category available right then, but it'll come around.
You probably get like complete groupies, hey?
I just have my loyal friends.
Yes. And you, Nnedi? Do you get isolated out of genre, kind of?
Do I isolate myself? Certainly not. I write what I want to write. I don't worry about when I'm writing something. I don't think about whether is this young adult or is this adult, and then act accordingly. I don't think that at all. When I'm writing young adult literature, it's usually after I've written it that I say, okay, this is young adult. I don't think about that. I don't think about whether this is science fiction or whether this is fantasy. As a matter of fact, I mix the two all the time, and I see that the two can coexist very easily in my world, so I don't have a problem with that. But I know lots of genre watchdogs who will say, oh, this has technology in it. This can't be fantasy, and this has magic in it. This can't be science. And, it's like, just relax. Just relax. A good story is a good story. So, and a lot of the genres are, and these categories are, as you were saying, they're marketing tools. That's really all they are. For example, Akata Witch is often called, by many reviewers, is compared to Harry Potter. It's called the African Harry Potter, which I find, censoring self, which I find that limiting. I find that, when people view it that way, they're not seeing half of the novel. They're totally ignoring it. So there are ways that people can find a way to relate to something that's new to them. And I understand that need to do that, but at the same time, I think that's limiting. For me, when I'm looking for a book, because I read just as much as I write, I don't look at is this the fantasy section? Let me go there. Is this the realism section? Let me go there. I just go and I find whatever I find. I read very widely. I don't stick with one thing. So that's the way I view it, if that answers your question.
Yes, we have another one.
Sorry about that. Well, as I'm glad I can adjust you, as a budding writer and a filmmaker as well, I'd like to know, sort of, as an individual writing that in a specific genre, how do you, I find in South Africa these days, it's very difficult to write in a specific genre because they have this idea of, oh no, you have to talk about poverty or township or apartheid. Yeah. I mean, to write about fiction, I mean, about science fiction or horror or it's like, I'm trying to phrase this properly, how do you bridge into the industry where, you can sell enough books, but, how do you get your market in that genre? Yeah, that's the question that I want.
Yeah.
Zinaid?
I think that's
Okay.
Sorry.
I know from my own experience, because like I said, I've never cared for categories, and I kind of just bulled my way in there. The way I thought of it, and really, I can't say I know exactly what I'm doing because I don't. I just do what I'm doing, and yeah. So the way that I've done that is to do what I'm doing, if that makes sense. Don't worry so much about whether this fits there and whether this is that. Just write the thing first. Write it, and then write it as well as you can. Edit it 1,000,000 times. Have other people read it, then go back and edit it again. And then once you feel that it's once you feel that it's together, then you put it out there. And then the feedback that you'll get, you'll find that when you get the feedback, they will tell you what it is. You just let them tell you what it is. Don't worry about because you don't want categories to dictate what you're writing. You want to write what you want to write. So just let them tell you what it is, and most of the time they're wrong anyway. It's just a marketing tool.
There's someone there. Right here.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. I just got a simple question to Nnedi. Decide. I'm decide.
I can't see. Okay, I see.
Okay. Big voice. Okay. Yeah, well, quickly, my question is, how conscious are you? Well, I was actually thinking it's for you, Nnedi, but for both of you. How conscious are you of this issue of the audience? I'm sure most writers really are not conscious about sales and all that. Yeah. When you're writing, you just want to write. But in terms of for you, Nnedi, you talk about these racial undertones in the specific genre where you are at. My brother reads a lot of fantasy, and I ended up reading up fantasy myself. But the friends that he has in his circle, they are all just white friends and a few Indian guys. So how conscious are you, and how are you concerned about who's reading you? Like, for example, I'm the only person that I know who knows Octavia Butler in Guamash. But I know there's a lot of people that do. I'm not condescending and saying other people don't, but I'm just saying, how conscious are you of the people that are reading? Your target market?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I know that like I'm always saying, I read as much as I write, and I think the audience that I'm thinking of is myself. I'm thinking, what would Nnedi want to read? Because really what made me start writing was that I wasn't seeing representations of myself in the type of stories that I wanted to read, which were stories that dealt with the mystical, stories that dealt with the future. I wasn't seeing representations of myself, so therefore I wrote them. So there's that. In terms of audience, really, really considering audience when I write, I do and I don't. For example, I know that when there are certain things that I can become obsessed with because I like creatures. I really like writing creatures, and I like having them crawling around and just dropping in front of characters and dropping on top of characters. I like creatures. I like bugs and things. And so they tend to people my stories. And And I know that there are times where I'll just go off on a complete tangent, and it will be completely fine. Like there in Zara the Windseeker, you've got her going on her adventure, and then there's a moment where the story literally stops, and she goes into some bushes to see some bush cows, which look like capybaras, playing drums and having a party. And I wrote that, and I was having fun with that, but it had nothing to do with the story. And so my editor looked at it and told me, Nnedi, you need to reel it back in. And so in that case, and I know that, so I tend to listen to my editor and my agent when it comes to certain things about audience, because I really don't think too hard about audience. I do think in terms of my readership. I hope to please them, but I'm not writing specifically to please them, which are two different things. But at the same time, yeah, I do listen to my editor and agent when they point out issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Guys, I'm sorry. I know there are other people who need to answer questions, but I have been given like the urgent timeout, so that's it. There are the fabulous books I know on the tables, especially I know both of yours are there. I've seen Cyrus at the Gates, and you're fabulous. Hold the cover up because you have to see it. The Tanuki Ichiban book, which is fabulous. And then I've definitely seen Who Fears Death out there. I'm not sure how many of your other books are on the table.
Yeah, Kata Witches.
Oh, good. All right, so if you want to buy some fabulous books tonight, go out there. The authors will be there to sign. You can whisper your questions to them one-on-one. But thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, and have a good night.